by John Galsworthy. The first and last. So the last shall be first, and the first last. Holy Writ. It was a dark room at that hour of 6 in the evening, when just the single oil reading lamp under its green shade let fall a dapple of light over the Turkey carpet, over the covers of books taken out of the bookshelves and the open pages of the ones selected, over the deep blue and gold of the coffee service on the little old stool with its oriental embroidery. Very dark in the winter, with drawn curtains, many rows of leather-bound volumes, oak-panelled walls and ceiling. So large, too, that the lighted spot before the fire where he sat was just an oasis. But that was what Keith Darrant liked, after his day's work. The hard, early morning study of his cases, the fret and strain of the day in court. It was his rest, these 2 hours before dinner, with books, coffee, a pipe, and sometimes a nap. In red Turkish slippers and his old brown velvet coat, he was well suited to that framing of glow and darkness. A painter would have seized avidly on his clear-cut yellowish face, with its dark eyebrows twisting up over eyes, grey or brown, one could hardly tell, and its dark grizzling hair still plentiful, in spite of those daily hours of wig. He seldom thought of his work while he sat there, throwing off with practice ease the strain of that long attention to the multiple threads of argument and evidence to be disentangled. Work profoundly interesting, as a rule, to his clear intellect, trained to almost instinctive rejection of all but the essential, to selection of what was legally vital out of the mass of confused tactical and human detail presented to his scrutiny, yet sometimes tedious and wearing. As for instance today, when he had suspected his client of perjury, and was almost convinced that he must throw up his brief. He had disliked the weak-looking, white-faced fellow from the first, and his nervous, shifty answers, his prominent, startled eyes, a type too common in these days of canting tolerations and weak humanitarianism. No good, no good. Of the 3 books he had taken down, a volume of Voltaire, curious fascination that Frenchman had, for all his destructive irony, a volume of Burton's Travels, and Stevenson's New Arabian Nights, he had pitched upon the last. He felt, that evening, the want of something sedative, a desire to rest from thought of any kind. The court had been crowded, stuffy, the air, as he walked home, soft sou'westerly, charged with coming moisture, no quality of vigor in it. He felt relaxed, tired, even nervy, and for once the loneliness of his house seemed strange and comfortless. Lowering the lamp, he turned his face towards the fire. Perhaps he would get asleep before that boring dinner at the Tellisons'. He wished it were vacation and Maisie back from school. A widower for many years, he had lost the habit of a woman about him, yet tonight he had a positive yearning for the society of his young daughter, with her quick ways and bright dark eyes. Curious what perpetual need of a woman some men had. His brother Lawrence, wasted, all through women, atrophy of willpower, a man on the edge of things, living from hand to mouth, his gifts all down at heel. One would have thought the Scottish strain might have saved him, and yet when a Scotsman did begin to go downhill, who could go faster? Curious that their mother's blood should have worked so differently in her 2 sons. He himself had always felt he owed all his success to it. His thoughts went off at a tangent to a certain issue troubling his legal conscience. He had not wavered in the usual assumption of omniscience, but he was by no means sure that he had given right advice. Well, without that power to decide and hold to decision in spite of misgiving, one would never have been fit for one's position at the bar. never have been fit for anything. The longer he lived, the more certain he became of the prime necessity of virile and decisive action in all the affairs of life. A word and a blow, and the blow first. Doubts, hesitations, sentiment, the mewling and puking of this twilight age. And there dwelled up on his handsome face a smile that was almost devilish. The tricks of firelight are so many. It faded again in sheer drowsiness. He slept. He woke with a start, having a feeling of something out beyond the light, and without turning his head said, "What's that?" There came a sound, as if somebody had caught his breath. He turned up the lamp. "Who's there?" A voice over by the door answered, "Only I, Larry." Something in the tone, or perhaps just being startled out of sleep like this, made him shiver. He said, "I was asleep. Come in." It was noticeable that he did not get up, or even turn his head, now that he knew who it was, but waited, his half-closed eyes fixed on the fire, for his brother to come forward. A visit from Laurence was not an unmixed blessing. He could hear him breathing, and became conscious of a scent of whiskey. Why could not the fellow at least abstain when he was coming here? It was so childish, so lacking in any sense of proportion or of decency. And he said sharply, "Well, Larry, what is it?" It was always something. He often wondered at the strength of that sense of trusteeship which kept him still tolerant of the troubles, amenable to the petitions of this brother of his. Or was it just blood feeling, a Highland sense of loyalty to kith and kin? An old-time quality which judgment and half his instincts told him was weakness, but which, in spite of all, bound him to the distressful fellow. Was he drunk now, that he kept lurking there out by the door? And he said, less sharply, "Why don't you come and sit down?" He was coming now, avoiding the light, skirting along the walls just beyond the radiance of the lamp, his feet and legs to the waist brightly lighted, but his face disintegrated in shadow, like the face of a dark ghost. "Are you ill, man?" Still no answer, save a shake of that head, and the passing up of a hand out of the light, to the ghostly forehead under the dishevelled hair. The scent of whiskey was stronger now, and Keith thought, "He really is drunk. Nice thing for the new butler to see. If he can't behave." The figure against the wall heaved a sigh, so truly from an overburdened heart, that Keith was conscious with a certain dismay of not having yet fathomed the cause of this uncanny silence. He got up, and back to the fire, said with a brutality born of nerves rather than design, "What is it, man? Have you committed a murder that you stand there dumb as a fish?" For a second, no answer at all, not even of breathing. Then just the whisper, "Yes." The sense of unreality, which so helps one at moments of disaster, enabled Keith to say vigorously, "By Jove, you have been drinking." But it passed at once into deadly apprehension. "What do you mean? Come here where I can see you. What's the matter with you, Larry?" With a sudden lurch and dive, his brother left the shelter of the shadow and sank into a chair in the circle of light. And another long, broken sigh escaped him. "There's nothing the matter with me, Keith. It's true." Keith stepped quickly forward and stared down into his brother's face, and instantly he saw that it was true. No one could have simulated the look in those eyes, of horrified wonder, as if they would never again get on terms with the face to which they belonged. To see them squeezed the heart. Only real misery could look like that. Then that sudden pity became angry bewilderment. What in God's name is this nonsense? But it was significant that he lowered his voice. Went over to the door, too, to see if it were shut. Lawrence had drawn his chair forward, huddling over the fire, a thin figure, a worn, high cheek-boned face with deep-sunk blue eyes and wavy hair all ruffled, a face that still had a certain beauty. Putting a hand on that lean shoulder, Keith said, "Come, Larry, pull yourself together and drop exaggeration. It's true, I tell you. I've killed a man." The noisy violence of that outburst acted like a douche. What was the fellow about, shouting out such words? But suddenly Lawrence lifted his hands and wrung them. The gesture was so utterly painful that it drew a quiver from Keith's face. "Why did you come here," he said, "and tell me this?" Larry's face was really unearthly sometimes, such strange gleams passed up onto it. "Whom else should I tell? I came to know what I'm to do, Keith. Give myself up, or what?" At that sudden introduction of the practical, Keith felt his heart twitch. Was it then as real as all that? But he said very quietly, "Just tell me, how did it come about, this affair?" That question linked the dark, gruesome, fantastic nightmare on to actuality. "When did it happen?" "Last night." In Larry's face there had always been, something childishly truthful. He would never stand a chance in court. And Keith said, "How? Where? You'd better tell me quietly from the beginning. Drink this coffee. It'll clear your head." Lawrence took the little blue cup and drained it. "Yes," he said, "it's like this, Keith. There's a girl I've known for some months now." "Women!" And Keith said between his teeth, "Well?" "Her father was a Pole who died over here when she was 16 and left her all alone. A man called Wallen, a mongrel American, living in the same house, married her, or pretended to. She's very pretty, Keith. He left her with a baby 6 months old, and another coming. That one died, and she did nearly. Then she starved till another fellow took her on. She lived with him 2 years. Then Wallen turned up again and made her go back to him. The brute used to beat her black and blue, all for nothing. And then he left her again. When I met her, she'd lost her elder child too, and was taking anybody who came along." He suddenly looked up into Keith's face. "But I've never met a sweeter woman, nor a truer. That I swear. Woman, she's only 20 now. When I went to her last night, that brute, that Wallen, had found her out again. And when he came for me, swaggering and bullying, look," he touched a dark mark on his forehead, "I took his throat in my hands, and when I let go..." "Yes?" "Dead. I never knew till afterwards that she was hanging on to him behind." Again he made that gesture, wringing his hands. In a hard voice Keith said, "What did you do then?" "We sat by it a long time. Then I carried it on my back down the street, round a corner to an archway." "How far?" "Oh, about 50 yards." "Was anyone did anyone see?" "No." "What time?" 3. "And then?" "Went back to her." "Why, in heaven's name?" "She was lonely and afraid. And so was I, Keith." "Where is this place?" 42 Borrow Street, Soho. And the archway? Corner of Glove Lane. Good God! Why, I saw it in the paper. And seizing the journal that lay on his bureau, Keith read again that paragraph. The body of a man was found this morning under an archway in Glove Lane, Soho. From marks about the throat, grave suspicions of foul play are entertained. The body had apparently been robbed, and nothing was discovered leading to identification. It was real earnest then. Murder! His own brother! He faced around and said, "You saw this in the paper and dreamed it. Understand? You dreamed it." The wistful answer came, "If only I had, Keith. If only I had." In his turn, Keith very nearly wrung his hands. "Did you take anything from the body?" This dropped while we were struggling. It was an empty envelope with a South American postmark addressed Patrick Wallen, Simon's Hotel, Farrier Street, London. Again, with that twitching in his heart, Keith said, "Put it in the fire." Then suddenly he stooped to pluck it out. By that command he had identified himself with this. But he did not pluck it out. It blackened, writhed, and vanished. And once more he said, "What in God's name made you come here and tell me? You know about these things. I didn't mean to kill him. I love the girl. What shall I do, Keith?" Simple! How simple! To ask what he was to do? It was like Larry. And he said, "You were not seen, you think? Well, it's a dark street. There was no one about. When did you leave this girl the second time?" "About 7:00. "Where did you go?" "To my rooms." "In Fitzroy Street?" "Yes." "Did anyone see you come in?" "No." "What have you done since?" "Sat there." "Not been out?" "No." "Not seen the girl?" "No." "You don't know, then, what she's done since?" "No." "Would she give you away?" "Never." "Would she give herself away? Hysteria?" "No." "Who knows of your relations with her?" "No one." "No one?" "I don't know who should, Keith." "Did anyone see you going in last night when you first went to her?" "No, she lives on the ground floor, and I've got keys." "Give them to me. What else have you that connects you with her?" "Nothing." "In your rooms?" "No." "No photographs? No letters?" "No." "Be careful." "Nothing." "No one saw you going back to her the second time?" "No." "No one saw you leave her in the morning?" "No." "You were fortunate. Sit down again, man. I must think." "Think? Think out this accursed thing, so beyond all thought and all belief." But he could not think. Not a coherent thought would come. And he began again. Was it his first reappearance with her? Yes. She told you so? Yes. How did he find out where she was? I don't know. How drunk were you? I was not drunk. How much had you drunk? Oh, about 2 bottles of claret. Nothing. You say you didn't mean to kill him? No, God knows. That's something. What made you choose the arch? It was the first dark place. Did his face look as if he had been strangled? Don't! Did it? Yes. Very disfigured? Yes. Did you look to see if his clothes were marked? No. Why not? Why not? My God, if you had done it! You say he was disfigured. Would he be recognizable? I don't know. When she lived with him last, where was that? I don't know for certain. Pimlico, I think. Not Soho? No. How long has she been in the Soho place? Nearly a year. Always the same rooms? Yes. Is there anyone living in that house or street who would be likely to know her as his wife? I don't think so. What was he? I should think he was a professional bully. I see. Spending most of his time abroad, then? Yes. Do you know if he was known to the police? I haven't heard of it. Now listen, Larry. When you leave here, go straight home, and don't go out till I come to you tomorrow morning. Promise that? I promise. I've got a dinner engagement. I'll think this out. Don't drink. Don't talk. Pull yourself together. Don't keep me longer than you can help, Keith. That white face, those eyes, that shaking hand, with a twinge of pity in the midst of all the turbulence of his revolt and fear and disgust. Keith put his hand on his brother's shoulder and said, "Courage." Then suddenly he thought, "My God, courage! I shall want it all myself." Lawrence Darrant, leaving his brother's house in the Adelphi, walked northwards, rapidly, slowly, rapidly again. For if there are men who by force of will do one thing only at a time, there are men who from lack of will do now one thing, now another, with equal intensity. To such natures, to be gripped by the nemesis which attends the lack of self-control is no reason for their being more self-controlled. Rather does it foster their pet feeling, what matter? Tomorrow we die. The effort of will required to go to Keith had relieved, exhausted, and exasperated him. In accordance with those three feelings was the progress of his walk. He started from the door with the fixed resolve to go home and stay there quietly till Keith came. He was in Keith's hands. Keith would know what was to be done. But he had not gone 300 yards before he felt so utterly weary, body and soul, that if he had but had a pistol in his pocket, he would have shot himself in the street. Not even the thought of the girl, this young unfortunate with her strange devotion, who had kept him straight these last 5 months, who had roused in him a depth of feeling he had never known before, would have availed against that sudden black defection. Why go on, a waif at the mercy of his own nature, a straw blown here and there by every gust which rose in him? Why not have done with it forever, and take it out in sleep? He was approaching the fatal street where he and the girl that early morning had spent the hours clutched together, trying in the refuge of love to forget for a moment their horror and fear. Should he go in? He had promised Keith not to. Why had he promised? He caught sight of himself in a chemist's lighted window. Miserable, shadowy brute. And he remembered suddenly a dog he had picked up once in the streets of Pera, a black and white creature, different from the other dogs, not one of their breed, a pariah of pariahs, who had strayed there somehow. He had taken it home to the house where he was staying, contrary to all custom of the country, had got fond of it, had shot it himself sooner than leave it behind again to the mercies of its own kind in the streets. 12 years ago, and those sleeve links made of the little Turkish coins he had brought back for the girl at the hairdresser's in Chancery Lane, where he used to get shaved. Pretty creature, like a wild rose. He had asked of her a kiss for payment. What queer emotions when she put her face forward to his lips, a sort of passionate tenderness and shame, at the softness and warmth of that flushed cheek, at her beauty and trustful gratitude. She would soon have given herself to him, that one. He had never gone there again. And to this day he did not know why he had abstained. To this day he did not know whether he were glad or sorry not to have plucked that rose. He must surely have been very different then. Queer business, life. Queer, queer business. To go through it never knowing what you would do next. Ah, to be like Keith, steady, buttoned up in success, a brass pot, a pillar of society. Once, as a boy, he had been within an ace of killing Keith for sneering at him. Once, in southern Italy, he had been near killing a driver who was flogging his horse. And now, that dark-faced, swinish bully who had ruined the girl he had grown to love. He had done it. Killed him. Killed a man. He who did not want to hurt a fly. The chemist's window comforted him with the sudden thought that he had at home that which made him safe, in case they should arrest him. He would never again go out without some of those little white tablets sewn into the lining of his coat. Restful, even exhilarating thought. They said a man should not take his own life. Let them taste horror, those glib citizens. Let them live as that girl had lived, as millions lived all over the world, under their canting dogmas. A man might rather even take his life than watch their cursed inhumanities. He went into the chemist's for a bromide, and while the man was mixing it, stood resting one foot like a tired horse. The life he had squeezed out of that fellow! After all, 1 billion living creatures gave up life each day. Had it squeezed out of them mostly? And perhaps not one a day deserved death so much as that loathly fellow. Life, a breath, a flame, nothing. Why, then, this icy clutching at his heart? The chemist brought the draught. Not sleeping, sir? No. The man's eyes seemed to say, yes, burning the candle at both ends, I know. Odd life, a chemist's. Pills and powders all day long, to hold the machinery of men together. Devilish odd trade. In going out, he caught the reflection of his face in a mirror. It seemed too good altogether for a man who had committed murder. There was a sort of brightness underneath, an amiability lurking about its shadows. How could it be the face of a man who had done what he had done? His head felt lighter now, his feet lighter. He walked rapidly again. Curious feeling of relief and oppression all at once. Frightful to long for company, for talk, for distraction, and to be afraid of it. The girl and Keith were now the only persons who would not give him that feeling of dread. And of those two, Keith was not. Who could consort with one who was never wrong, a successful, righteous fellow, a chap built so that he knew nothing about himself, wanted to know nothing, a chap all solid actions? To be a quicksand swallowing up one's own resolutions was bad enough, but to be like Keith, all willpower, marching along, treading down his own feelings and weaknesses. No, one could not make a comrade of a man like Keith, even if he were one's brother. The only creature in all the world was the girl. She alone knew and felt what he was feeling. Would put up with him and love him, whatever he did, or was done to him. He stopped and took shelter in a doorway to light a cigarette. He had suddenly a fearful wish to pass the archway where he had placed the body. A fearful wish that had no sense, no end in view, no anything. just an insensate craving to see the dark place again. He crossed Borrow Street to the little lane. There was only one person visible, a man on the far side, with his shoulders hunched against the wind, a short, dark figure which crossed and came towards him in the flickering lamplight. What a face! Yellow, ravaged, clothed almost to the eyes in a stubbly, greyish growth of beard, with blackish teeth and haunting, bloodshot eyes. And what a figure of rags, one shoulder higher than the other, one leg a little lame, and thin. A surge of feeling came up in Laurence for this creature, more unfortunate than himself. There were lower depths than his. "Well, brother," he said, "you don't look too prosperous." The smile which gleamed out on the man's face seemed as unlikely as a smile on a scarecrow. "Prosperity doesn't come my way," he said in a rusty voice. "I'm a failure. Always been a failure. And yet you wouldn't think it, would you? I was a minister of religion once." Laurence held out a shilling, but the man shook his head. "Keep your money," he said. "I've got more than you today, I dare say, but thank you for taking a little interest. That's worth more than money to a man that's down." "You're right." "Yes," the rusty voice went on, "I'd as soon die as go on living as I do. And now I've lost my self-respect. Often wondered how long a starving man would go without losing his self-respect. Not so very long. You take my word for that." And without the slightest change in the monotony of that creaking voice, he added: "Did you read of the murder? Just here. I've been looking at the place." The words "So have I" leaped up to Laurence's lips. He choked them back with a sort of terror. "I wish you better luck," he said. "Good night," and hurried away. A sort of ghastly laughter was forcing its way up in his throat. Was everyone talking of the murder he had committed? Even the very scarecrows? There are some natures so constituted that, due to be hung at 10 o'clock, they will play chess at 8. Such men invariably rise. They make especially good bishops, editors, judges, impresarios, prime ministers, moneylenders, and generals. In fact, fill with exceptional credit any position of power over their fellow men. They have spiritual cold storage, in which are preserved their nervous systems. In such men there is little or none of that fluid sense and continuity of feeling known under those vague terms speculation, poetry, philosophy. Men of facts and of decision, switching imagination on and off at will, subordinating sentiment to reason. One does not think of them when watching wind ripple over cornfields or swallows flying. Keith Darrant had need of being of that breed during his dinner at the Tellisons'. It was just 11 when he issued from the big house in Portland Place and refrained from taking a cab. He wanted to walk that he might better think. What crude and wanton irony there was in his situation! To have been made father confessor to a murderer, he, well on towards a judgeship. With his contempt for the kind of weakness which landed men in such abysses, he felt it all so sordid, so impossible, that he could hardly bring his mind to bear on it at all. And yet he must, because of two powerful instincts, self-preservation and blood loyalty. The wind had still the sapping softness of the afternoon, but rain had held off so far. It was warm, and he unbuttoned his fur overcoat. The nature of his thoughts deepened the dark austerity of his face, whose thin, well-cut lips were always pressing together, as if by meeting to dispose of each thought as it came up. He moved along the crowded pavements glumly. That air of festive conspiracy which drops with the darkness on to lighted streets galled him. He turned off on a darker route. This ghastly business! Convinced of its reality, he yet could not see it. The thing existed in his mind, not as a picture, but as a piece of irrefutable evidence. Larry had not meant to do it, of course, but it was murder all the same. Men like Larry, weak, impulsive, sentimental, introspective creatures, did they ever mean what they did? This man, this Wallen, was by all accounts better dead than alive. No need to waste a thought on him. But crime, the ugliness, justice unsatisfied, crime concealed, and his own share in the concealment. And yet, brother to brother. Surely no one could demand action from him. It was only a question of what he was going to advise Larry to do. To keep silent and disappear? Had that a chance of success? Perhaps, if the answers to his questions had been correct. But this girl, suppose the dead man's relationship to her were ferreted out, could she be relied on not to endanger Larry? These women were all the same, unstable as water, emotional, shiftless pests of society. Then, too, a crime untracked, dogging all his brother's afterlife. A secret following him wherever he might vanish to, hanging over him, watching for some drunken moment to slip out of his lips. It was bad to think of. A clean breast of it? But his heart twitched within him. Brother of Mr. Keith Darrant, the well-known King's Counsel, visiting a woman of the town, strangling with his bare hands the woman's husband. No intention to murder, but a dead man carried out of the house, laid under a dark archway. Provocation, recommended to mercy, penal servitude for life. Was that the advice he was going to give Larry tomorrow morning? And he had a sudden vision of shaven men with clay-colored features, run, as it were, to seed, as he had seen them once in Pentonville, when he had gone there to visit a prisoner. Larry, whom as a baby creature he had watched straddling, whom as a little fellow he had fagged, whom he had seen through scrapes at college, to whom he had lent money time and again admonished in his courses. Larry, 5 years younger than himself, and committed to his charge by their mother when she died. To become for life one of those men with faces like diseased plants, with no hair but a bushy stubble, with arrows marked on their yellow clothes. Larry? One of those men herded like sheep, at the beck and call of common men, a gentleman, his own brother, to live that slave's life, to be ordered here and there, year after year, day in, day out. Something snapped within him. He could not give that advice. Impossible! But if not, he must make sure of his ground, must verify, must know. This Glove Lane, this archway, it would not be far from where he was that very moment. He looked for someone of whom to make inquiry. A policeman was standing at the corner, his stolid face illumined by a lamp, capable and watchful, an excellent officer, no doubt. But, turning his head away, Keith passed him without a word. Strange to feel that cold, uneasy feeling in presence of the law. A grim little driving home of what it all meant. Then suddenly he saw that the turning to his left was Barrow Street itself. He walked up one side, crossed over, and returned. He passed number 42, a small house with business names printed on the lifeless windows of the first and second floors, with dark curtained windows on the ground floor. Or was there just a slink of light in one corner? Which way had Larry turned? Which way under that grisly burden? 50 paces of this squalid street, narrow and dark and empty, thank heaven. Glove Lane, here it was, a tiny runlet of a street. And here he had run right on to the arch, a brick bridge connecting two portions of a warehouse, and dark indeed. "That's right, guv'nor. That's the place." He needed all his self-control to turn leisurely to the speaker. "'Ere's where they found the body. Very spot leanin' up here. They ain't got him yet, lightest, me lord." It was a ragged boy holding out a tattered yellowish journal. His lynx eyes peered up from under lanky wisps of hair, and his voice had the proprietary note of one making a corner in his news. Keith took the paper and gave him tuppence. He even found a sort of comfort in the young ghouls hanging out about there. It meant that others beside himself had come morbidly to look. By the dim lamplight he read, "Glove Lane garroting mystery. Nothing has yet been discovered of the murdered man's identity. From the cut of his clothes he is supposed to be a foreigner." The boy had vanished, and Keith saw the figure of a policeman coming slowly down this gutter of a street. A second's hesitation, and he stood firm. Nothing obviously could have brought him here save this mystery, and he stayed quietly staring at the arch. The policeman moved up abreast. Keith saw that he was the one whom he had passed just now. He noted the cold, offensive question die out of the man's eyes when they caught the gleam of white shirt front under the opened fur collar. And holding up the paper, he said, "Is this where the man was found?" "Yes, sir." "Still a mystery, I see. Well, we can't always go by the papers, but I don't fancy they do know much yet about it. Dark spot. Do fellows sleep under here?" The policeman nodded. "There's not an arch in London where we don't get 'em sometimes." "Nothing found on him, I think I read?" "Not a copper. Pockets inside out. There's some funny characters about this quarter. Greeks, Hitalians, all sorts." Queer sensation this, of being glad of a policeman's confidential tone. "Well, good night." "Good night, sir. Good night." He looked back from Borrow Street. The policeman was still standing there, holding up his lantern, so that its light fell into the archway, as if trying to read its secret. Now that he had seen this dark, deserted spot, the chances seemed to him much better. Pockets inside out? Either Larry had had presence of mind to do a very clever thing, or someone had been at the body before the police found it. That was the more likely. A dead backwater of a place, at 3:00, loneliest of all hours. Larry's 5 minutes' grim excursion to and from might well have passed unseen. Now it all depended on the girl, on whether Lawrence had been seen coming to her or going away, or whether, if the man's relationship to her were discovered, she could be relied on to say nothing. There was not a soul in Borrow Street now, hardly even a lighted window, and he took one of those rather desperate decisions only possible to men daily accustomed to the instant taking of responsibility. He would go to her and see for himself. He came to the door of 42, obviously one of those which are only shut at night, and tried the larger key. It fitted, and he was in a gas-lighted passage, with an oil-clothed floor and a single door to his left. He stood there undecided. She must be made to understand that he knew everything. She must not be told more than that he was a friend of Larry's. She must not be frightened, yet must be forced to give her very soul away. A hostile witness, not to be treated as hostile. A matter for delicate handling. But his knock was not answered. Should he give up this nerve-racking, bizarre effort to come at a basis of judgment? Go away and just tell Lawrence that he could not advise him? And then what? Something must be done. He knocked again. Still no answer. and with that impatience of being thwarted natural to him, and fostered to the full by the conditions of his life, he tried the other key. It worked, and he opened the door. Inside all was dark, but a voice from some way off, and with a sort of breathless relief in its foreign tones, said: "Oh, then, it's you, Larry. Why did you knock? I was so frightened. Turn up the light, dear. Come in." Feeling by the door for a switch in the pitch blackness, he was conscious of arms around his neck, a warm, thinly clad body pressed to his own, then withdrawn as quickly, with a gasp, and the most awful, terror-stricken whisper: "Oh, who is it?" With a glacial shiver from his own spine, Keith answered: "A friend of Lawrence. Don't be frightened." There was such silence that he could hear a clock ticking, and the sound of his own hand passing over the surface of the wall, trying to find the switch. He found it, and in the light which leaped up, he saw, stiffened against a dark curtain evidently screening off a bedroom, a girl standing, holding a long black coat together at her throat, so that her face, with its pale brown hair, short and square cut and curling up underneath, had an uncanny look of being detached from any body. Her face was so alabaster pale that the staring, startled eyes, dark blue or brown, and the faint rose of the parted lips, were like color stainings on a white mask, and it had a strange delicacy, truth, and pathos, such as only suffering brings. Though not susceptible to aesthetic emotion, Keith was curiously affected. He said gently: "You needn't be afraid. I haven't come to do you harm. Quite the contrary. May I sit down and talk?" And holding up the keys, he added: "Lawrence wouldn't have given me these, would he, if he hadn't trusted me?" Still she did not move, and he had the impression that he was looking at a spirit startled out of its flesh. Nor at the moment did it seem in the least strange that he should conceive such an odd thought. He stared around the room, clean and tawdry, with its tarnished gilt mirror, marble-topped side table, and plush-covered sofa. 20 years and more since he had been in such a place. And he said: "Won't you sit down? I'm sorry to have startled you." But still she did not move, whispering: "Who are you, please?" And moved suddenly beyond the realm of caution by the terror of that whisper, he answered: "Larry's brother." She uttered a little sigh of relief, which went to Keith's heart, and, still holding the dark coat together at her throat, came forward and sat down on the sofa. He could see that her feet, thrust into slippers, were bare. With her short hair and those candid, startled eyes, she looked like a tall child. He drew up a chair and said: "You must forgive me coming at such an hour. He's told me, you see." He expected her to flinch and gasp, but she only clasped her hands together on her knees and said: "Yes?" Then horror and discomfort rose up in him afresh. "An awful business!" Her whisper echoed him. "Yes, oh yes, awful! It is awful!" And suddenly realizing that the man must have fallen dead just where he was sitting, Keith came stock silent, staring at the floor. "Yes," she whispered, "just there. I see him now, always falling." How she said that, with such a strange, gentle despair. In this girl of evil life, who had brought on them this tragedy, what was it which moved him to a sort of unwilling compassion? "You look very young," he said. "I am 20." "And you are fond of my brother?" "I would die for him." Impossible to mistake the tone of her voice, or the look in her eyes. True, deep Slav eyes. Dark brown, not blue as he had thought at first. It was a very pretty face, Either her life had not eaten into it yet, or the suffering of these last hours had purged away those marks, or perhaps this devotion of hers to Larry. He felt strangely at sea, sitting there with this child of 20. He, over 40, a man of the world, professionally used to every side of human nature. But he said, stammering a little, I have come to see how far you can save him. Listen and just answer the questions I put to you." She raised her hands, squeezed them together, and murmured, "Oh, I will answer anything." "This man, then, your husband, was he a bad man? A dreadful man? Before he came here last night, how long since you saw him?" 18 months. "Where did you live when you saw him last?" "In Pimlico." "Does anybody about here know you as Mrs. Wallen?" "No. When I came here, after my little girl died, I came to live a bad life. Nobody knows me at all. I am quite alone." "If they discover who he was, they will look for his wife?" "I do not know. He did not let people think I was married to him. I was very young. He treated many, I think, like me." "Do you think he was known to the police?" She shook her head. "He was very clever." "What is your name now?" "Wanda Levinska." "Were you known by that name before you were married?" "Wanda is my Christian name. Levinska I just call myself." "I see. Since you came here?" "Yes." "Did my brother ever see this man before last night?" "Never." "You had told him about his treatment of you?" "Yes, and that man first went for him." "I saw the mark. Do you think anyone saw my brother come to you?" "I do not know. He says not." "Can you tell if anyone saw him carrying the thing away?" "No one in this street. I was looking." "Nor coming back?" "No one." "Nor going out in the morning?" "I do not think it." "Have you a servant?" "Only a woman who comes at 9 in the morning for an hour." "Does she know Larry?" "No." "Friends, acquaintances?" "No. I am very quiet. And since I knew your brother, I see no one. Nobody comes here but him for a long time now." "How long?" 5 months." "Have you been out today?" "No." "What have you been doing?" "Crying." It was said with a certain dreadful simplicity, and pressing her hands together, she went on: "He is in danger because of me. I am so afraid for him." Holding up his hand to check that emotion, he said, "Look at me." She fixed those dark eyes on him, and in her bare throat, from which the coat had fallen back, he could see her resolutely swallowing down her agitation. "If the worst comes to worst, and this man is traced to you, can you trust yourself not to give my brother away?" Her eyes shone. She got up and went to the fireplace. "Look, I have burned all the things he has given me, even his picture. Now I have nothing from him." Keith too got up. "Good. One more question. Do the police know you because of your life?" She shook her head, looking at him intently with those mournfully true eyes, and he felt a sort of shame. "I was obliged to ask. Do you know where he lives?" "Yes." "You must not go there, and he must not come to you here." Her lips quivered, but she bowed her head. Suddenly he found her quite close to him, speaking almost in a whisper. "Please do not take him from me altogether. I will be so careful. I will not do anything to hurt him. But if I cannot see him sometimes, I shall die. Please do not take him from me." And catching his hand between her own, She pressed it desperately. It was several seconds before Keith said: "Leave that to me. I will see him. I will arrange. You must leave that to me." "But you will be kind?" He felt her lips kissing his hand, and the soft, moist touch sent a queer feeling through him, protective, yet just a little brutal, having in it a shiver of sensuality. He withdrew his hand, and as if warned that she had been too pressing, she recoiled humbly. But suddenly she turned and stood absolutely rigid. Then almost inaudibly whispered: "Listen! Someone out there!" And darting past him, she turned out the light. Almost at once came a knock on the door. He could actually feel the terror of this girl beside him in the dark, and he too felt terror. Who could it be? No one came but Larry, she had said. Who else then could it be? Again came the knock, louder. He felt the breath of her whisper on his cheek. "If it is Larry, I must open." He shrank back against the wall, heard her open the door and say faintly: "Yes, please. Who?" Light painted a thin moving line on the wall opposite, and a voice which Keith recognized answered: "All right, miss. Your outer door's open here. You ought to keep it shut after dark." God! That policeman! And it had been his own doing, not shutting the outer door behind him when he came in. He heard her say timidly in her foreign voice: "Thank you, sir." The policeman's retreating steps, the outer door being shut, and felt her close to him again. That something in her youth and strange prettiness which had touched and kept him gentle no longer blunted the edge of his exasperation, now that he could not see her. They were all the same, these women, could not speak the truth, and he said brusquely: "You told me they didn't know you." Her voice answered like a sigh: "I did not think they did, sir. It is so long I was not out in the town, not since I had Larry." The repulsion which all the time seethed deep in Keith welled up at those words. His brother, son of his mother, a gentleman, the property of this girl, bound to her body and soul by this unspeakable event. But she had turned up the light. Had she some intuition that darkness was against her? Yes, she was pretty with that soft face, colorless save for its lips and dark eyes, with that face somehow so touchingly, so unaccountably good, and like a child's. "I am going now," he said. "Remember, he mustn't come here. You mustn't go to him. I shall see to him tomorrow. If you are as fond of him as you say, take care, take care." She sighed out, "Yes, oh yes," and Keith went to the door. She was standing with her back to the wall, and to follow him she only moved her head. That dove-like face, with all its life in eyes which seemed saying: "Look into us. Nothing we hide. All is here." And he went out. In the passage he paused before opening the outer door. He did not want to meet that policeman again. The fellows round should have taken him well out of the street by now, and turned the handle cautiously. He looked out. No one in sight. He stood a moment, wondering if he should turn to right or left, then briskly crossed the street. A voice to his right hand said: "Good night, sir." There, in the shadow of a doorway, the policeman was standing. The fellow must have seen him coming out. Utterly unable to restrain a start, and muttering "Good night," Keith walked on rapidly. He went full quarter of a mile before he lost that startled and uneasy feeling in sardonic exasperation that he, Keith Darrant, had been taken for a frequenter of a lady of the town. The whole thing, a vile and disgusting business. His very mind felt dirty and breathless. His spirit, drawn out of breath, had slowly to slide back before he could at all focus and readjust his reasoning faculty. Certainly he had got the knowledge he wanted. There was less danger than he thought. That girl's eyes, no mistaking her devotion. She would not give Larry away. Yes, Larry must clear out. South America, the East, it did not matter. But he felt no relief. The cheap, tawdry room had wrapped itself round his fancy with its atmosphere of murky love, with the feeling it inspired, of emotion caged within those yellowish walls and the red stuff of its furniture. That girl's face, devotion, truth too, and beauty, rare and moving in its setting of darkness and horror, in that nest of vice and of disorder, the dark archway, the street Arab with his gleeful "They ain't got 'em yet," the feel of those bare arms around his neck, that whisper of horror in the darkness, above all, again, her child face looking into his, so truthful. And suddenly he stood quite still in the street. What in God's name was he about? What grotesque juggling amongst shadows, what strange and ghastly eccentricity was all this? The forces of order and routine, all the actualities of his daily life, marched on him at the moment and swept everything before them. It was a dream, a nightmare, not real. It was ridiculous that he should thus be bound up with such things so black and bizarre. He had come by now to the Strand, that street down which every day he moved to the law courts, to his daily work. His work so dignified and regular, so irreproachable and solid. No, the thing was all a monstrous nightmare. It would go if he fixed his mind on the familiar objects around, read the names on the shops, look at the faces passing. Far down the thoroughfare he caught the outline of the old church, and beyond the loom of the law courts themselves. The bell of a fire engine sounded, and the horses came galloping by, with the shining metal rattle of hoofs and hoarse shouting. Here was a sensation real and harmless, dignified and customary. A woman flaunting round the corner looked up at him and leered out, "Good night." Even that was customary, tolerable. Two policemen passed, supporting between them a man the worse for liquor, full of fight and expletives. The sight was soothing, an ordinary thing, which brought passing annoyance, interest, disgust. It had begun to rain. He felt it on his face, with pleasure, an actual thing, not eccentric, a thing which happened every day. He began crossing the street. Cabs were going at furious speeds now that the last omnibus had ceased to run. It distracted him to take this actual ordinary risk run so often every day. During that crossing of the Strand, with the rain in his face and the cabs shooting past, he regained for the first time his assurance, shook off this unreal sense of being in the grip of something, and walked resolutely to the corner of his home turning. But passing into that darker stretch, he again stood still. A policeman had also turned into that street on the other side. Not, surely not. Absurd. They were all alike to look at, those fellows. Absurd. He walked on sharply and let himself into his house. But on his way upstairs he could not for the life of him help raising a corner of a curtain and looking from the staircase window. The policeman was marching solemnly about 25 yards away, paying apparently no attention to anything whatever. Keith woke at 5 o'clock, his usual hour, without remembrance. but the grisly shadow started up when he entered his study, where the lamp burned and the fire shone, and the coffee was set ready, just as when yesterday afternoon Larry had stood out there against the wall. For a moment he fought against realization, then, drinking off his coffee, sat down sullenly at the bureau to his customary 3 hour study of the day's cases. Not one word of his brief could he take in. It was all jumbled with murky images and apprehensions, and for full half an hour he suffered mental paralysis. Then the sheer necessity of knowing something of the case which he had to open at 10:30 that morning forced him to a concentration which never quite subdued the malaise at the bottom of his heart. Nevertheless, when he rose at 8:30 and went into the bathroom, he had earned his grim satisfaction in this victory of will power. By 9:30 he must be at Larry's. A boat left London for the Argentine tomorrow. If Larry was to get away at once, money must be arranged for. And then at breakfast he came on this paragraph in the paper: Soho murder. Inquiry late last night established the fact that the police have discovered the identity of the man found strangled yesterday morning under an archway in Glove Lane. An arrest has been made. By good fortune he had finished eating, for the words made him feel physically sick. At this very moment Larry might be locked up, waiting to be charged, might even have been arrested before his own visit to the girl last night. If Larry were arrested, she must be implicated. What, then, would be his own position? Idiot to go and look at that archway, to go and see the girl. Had that policeman really followed him home? Accessory after the fact. Keith Darrant, King's Counsel, man of mark. He forced himself, by an effort which had something of the heroic, to drop this panicky feeling. Panic never did good. He must face it and see. He refused even to hurry, calmly collected the papers wanted for the day, and attended to a letter or two before he set out in a taxicab to Fitzroy Street. Waiting outside there in the grey morning for his ring to be answered, he looked the very picture of a man who knew his mind, a man of resolution. But it needed all his will power to ask without tremor, "Mr. Darrant in?" To hear without sign of any kind the answer, "He's not up yet, sir." "Never mind, I'll go in and see him. Mr. Keith Darrant." On his way to Laurence's bedroom, in the midst of utter relief, he had the self-possession to think: "This arrest is the best thing that could have happened. It'll keep their noses on a wrong scent till Larry's got away. The girl must be sent off too, but not with him." Panic had ended in quite hardening his resolution. He entered the bedroom with a feeling of disgust. The fellow was lying there, his bare arms crossed behind his tousled head, staring at the ceiling and smoking one of many cigarettes whose ends littered a chair beside him, whose sickly reek tainted the air. That pale face, with its jutting cheekbones and chin, its hollow cheeks and blue eyes far sunk back, what a wreck of goodness! He looked up at Keith through the haze of smoke and said quietly: "Well, brother, what's the sentence? Transportation for life, and then to be fined £40?" The flippancy revolted Keith. It was Larry all over. Last night horrified and humble, this morning don't care and feather-headed. He said sourly: "Oh, you can joke about it now." Laurence turned his face to the wall. Must. Fatalism? How detestable were natures like that! "I've been to see her," he said. "You?" "Last night. She can be trusted." Laurence laughed. "That I told you." "I had to see for myself. You must clear out at once, Larry. She can come out to you by the next boat. But you can't go together. Have you any money?" "No." "Well, I can foot your expenses, and lend you a year's income in advance. But it must be clean cut. After you get out of there, your whereabouts must only be known to me." A long sigh answered him. "You're very good to me, Keith. You've always been very good. I don't know why." Keith answered dryly: "Nor I. There's a boat to the Argentine tomorrow. You're in luck. They've made an arrest. It's in the paper." "What?" The cigarette end dropped, the thin pajamaed figure writhed up and stood clutching at the bed rail. "What?" The disturbing thought flitted through Keith's brain: "I was a fool. He takes it queerly. What now?" Laurence passed his hand over his forehead and sat down on the bed. "I hadn't thought of that," he said. "It does me." Keith stared. In his relief that the arrested man was not Laurence, this had not occurred to him. What folly! "Why?" he said quickly. "An innocent man's in no danger. They always get the wrong man first. It's a piece of luck, that's all. It gives us time." How often had he not seen that expression on Larry's face, wistful, questioning, as if trying to see the thing with his, Keith's, eyes, trying to submit to better judgment. And he said almost gently: "Now look here, Larry, this is too serious to trifle with. Don't worry about that. Leave it to me. Just get ready to be off. I'll take your berth and make arrangements. Here's some money for Kit. I can come round between 5 and 6 and let you know. Pull yourself together, man. As soon as the girls joined you out there, you'd better get across to Chile. The further the better. You must simply lose yourself. I must go now, if I'm to get to the bank before I go down to the courts." And looking very steadily at his brother, he added: "Come, you've got to think of me in this matter as well as of yourself. No playing fast and loose with the arrangements. Understand?" But still Larry gazed up at him with that wistful questioning, and not till he had repeated "Understand?" did he receive "Yes" for an answer. Driving away, he thought: "Queer fellow. I don't know him, shall never know him," and at once began to concentrate on the practical arrangements. At his bank he drew out £400, but waiting for the notes to be counted, he suffered qualms. A clumsy way of doing things. If there had been more time! The thought, accessory after the fact, now infected everything. Notes were traceable. No other way of getting him away at once, though. One must take lesser risks to avoid greater. From the bank he drove to the office of the steamship line. He had told Larry he would book his passage. But that would not do. He must only ask anonymously if there were accommodation. Having discovered that there were vacant berths, he drove on to the law courts. If he could have taken a morning off, he would have gone down to the police court and seen them charge this man. But even that was not too safe, with a face so well known as his. What would come of this arrest? Nothing, surely. The police always took somebody up to keep the public quiet. Then, suddenly, he had again the feeling that it was all a nightmare. Larry had never done it. The police had got the right man. But instantly the memory of the girl's awe-stricken face, her figure huddling on the sofa, her words, "I see him always following," came back. God, what a business! He felt he had never been more clear-headed and forcible than that morning in court. When he came out for lunch, he bought the most sensational of the evening papers. But it was yet too early for news, and he had to go back into court no whit wiser concerning the arrest. When at last he threw off wig and gown, and had got through a conference and other necessary work, he went out to Chancery Lane, buying a paper on the way. Then he hailed a cab and drove once more to Fitzroy Street. Lawrence had remained sitting on his bed for many minutes. An innocent man in no danger. Keith had said it, the celebrated lawyer. Could he rely on that? Go out 8,000 miles, he and the girl, and leave a fellow creature, perhaps in mortal peril, for an act committed by himself? In the past night he had touched bottom, as he thought, become ready to face anything. When Keith came in, he would without murmur have accepted the vice, "Give yourself up." He was prepared to pitch away the end of his life, as he pitched from him the fag ends of his cigarettes. And the long sigh he had heaved, hearing of reprieve, had been only half relief. Then, with incredible swiftness, there had rushed through him a feeling of unutterable joy and hope. Clean away, into a new country, a new life. The girl and he. Out there he wouldn't care, would rejoice even to have squashed the life out of such a noisome beetle of a man. Out there, under a new sun, where blood ran thicker than in this foggy land, and people took justice into their own hands. For it had been justice on that brute, even though he had not meant to kill him. And then to hear of this arrest! They would be charging the man today. He could go and see the poor creature accused of the murder he himself had committed. And he laughed. Go and see how likely it was that they might hang a fellow man in place of himself. He dressed, but too shaky to shave himself, went out to a barber's shop. While there, he read the news which Keith had seen. In this paper the name of the arrested man was given: John Evan, no address. To be brought up on the charge at Bow Street. Yes, he must go. Once, twice, 3 times he walked past the entrance of the court, before at last he entered and screwed himself away among the tag and bobtail. The court was crowded, and from the murmurs round he could tell that it was his particular case which had brought so many there. In a dazed way he watched charge after charge disposed of with lightning quickness. But were they never going to reach his business? And then suddenly he saw the little scarecrow man of last night advancing to the dock between 2 policemen, more ragged and miserable than ever by light of day, like some shaggy, wan, grey animal surrounded by sleek hounds. A sort of satisfied purr was rising all around, and with horror Lawrence perceived that this was the man accused of what he himself had done, this queer, battered unfortunate to whom he had shown a passing friendliness. Then all feeling merged in the appalling interest of listening. The evidence was very short. Testimony of the hotel keeper where Wallen had been staying, the identification of his body, and of a snake-shaped ring he had been wearing at dinner that evening. Testimony of a pawnbroker that this same ring was pawned with him the first thing yesterday morning by the prisoner. Testimony of a policeman that he had noticed the man Evan several times in Glove Lane, and twice moved him on from sleeping under that arch. Testimony of another policeman that, when arrested at midnight, Evan had said, "Yes, I took the ring off his finger. I found him there, dead. I know I oughtn't to have done it. I'm an educated man. It was stupid to pawn the ring. I found him with his pockets turned inside out." Fascinating and terrible to sit staring at the man in whose place he should have been. To wonder when those small, bright grey, bloodshot eyes would spy him out, and how he would meet that glance. Like a baited raccoon the little man stood, screwed back into a corner, mournful, cynical, fierce, with his ridged, obtuse yellow face, and his stubbly grey beard and hair, and his eyes wandering now and again amongst the crowd. But with all his might Lawrence kept his face unmoved. Then came the word "remanded," and, more like a baited beast than ever, the man was led away. Lawrence sat on, a cold perspiration thick on his forehead. Someone else, then, had come on the body and turned the pockets inside out before John Evan took the ring. A man such as Wallen would not be out at night without money. Besides, if Evan had found the money on the body, he would never have run the risk of taking that ring. Yes, someone else had come on the body first. It was for that one to come forward and prove that the ring was still on the dead man's finger when he left him, and thus clear Evan. He clung to that thought. It seemed to make him less responsible for the little man's position, to remove him and his own deed one step further back. If they found the person who had taken the money, it would prove Evan's innocence. He came out of the court in a sort of trance, and a craving to get drunk attacked him. One could not go on like this without the relief of some oblivion. If he could only get drunk, keep drunk till this business was decided and he knew whether he must give himself up or no. He had now no fear at all of people suspecting him, only fear of himself, fear that he might go and give himself up. Now he could see the girl. The danger from that was as nothing compared with the danger from his own conscience. He had promised Keith not to see her. Keith had been decent and loyal to him. Good old Keith. But he would never understand that this girl was now all he cared about in life, that he would rather be cut off from life itself than be cut off from her. Instead of becoming less and less, she was becoming more and more to him. Experience strange and thrilling. Out of deep misery she had grown happy. Through him. Out of a sordid, shifting life, recovered coherence and bloom through devotion to him of all people in the world. It was a miracle. She demanded nothing of him, adored him as no other woman ever had. It was this which had anchored his drifting bark. This, and her truthful, mild intelligence and that burning warmth of a woman, who, long treated by men as but a sack of sex, now loves at last. And suddenly, mastering his craving to get drunk, he made toward Soho. He had been a fool to give those keys to Keith. She must have been frightened by his visit, and perhaps doubly miserable since, knowing nothing, imagining everything. Keith was sure to have terrified her. Poor little thing. Down the street, where he had stolen in the dark with the dead body on his back, he almost ran for the cover of her house. The door was open to him before he knocked. Her arms were round his neck, her lips pressed to his. The fire was out, as if she had been unable to remember to keep warm. A stool had been drawn to the window, and there she had evidently been sitting, like a bird in a cage, looking out into the grey street. Though she had been told that he was not to come, instinct had kept her there, or the pathetic, aching hope against hope which lovers never part with. Now that he was there, her first thoughts were for his comfort. The fire was lighted. He must eat, drink, smoke. There was never in her doings any of the "I am doing this for you, but you ought to be doing that for me," which belongs to so many marriages and liaisons. She was like a devoted slave, so in love with the chains that she never knew she wore them. And to Lawrence, who had so little sense of property, this only served to deepen tenderness and the hold she had on him. He had resolved not to tell her of the new danger he ran from his own conscience. But resolutions with him were but the opposites of what was sure to come, and at last the words, "They have arrested someone," escaped him. From her face he knew she had grasped the danger at once, had divined it, perhaps, before he spoke. But she only twined her arms around him and kissed his lips, and he knew that she was begging him to put his love for her above his conscience. Who would ever have thought that he could feel as he did to this girl who had been in the arms of many? The stained and suffering past of a loved woman. awakens in some men only chivalry. In others, more respectable, it arouses a tigerish itch, a rancorous jealousy of what in the past was given to others. Sometimes it will do both. When he had her in his arms, he felt no remorse for killing the coarse, handsome brute who had ruined her. He savagely rejoiced in it. But when she laid her head in the hollow of his shoulder, turning to him her white face with the faint color staining on the parted lips, the cheeks, the eyelids, when her dark, wide apart brown eyes gazed up in the happiness of her abandonment, he felt only tenderness and protection. He left her at 5 o'clock, and had not gone 2 streets' length before the memory of the little grey vagabond, screwed back in the far corner of the dock like a baited raccoon, of his dreary, creaking voice, took possession of him again, and a kind of savagery mounted in his brain against a world where one could be so tortured without having meant harm to anyone. At the door of his lodging, Keith was getting out of a cab. They went in together, but neither of them sat down. Keith standing with his back to the carefully shut door, Laurence with his back to the table, as if they knew there was a tug coming. And Keith said, "There's room on that boat. Go down and book your berth before they shut. Here's the money." "I'm going to stick it, Keith." Keith stepped forward and put a roll of notes on the table. "Now, look here, Larry. I've read the police court proceedings. There's nothing in that. Out of prison or in prison for a few weeks, it's all the same to a nightbird of that sort. Dismiss it from your mind. There's not nearly enough evidence to convict. This gives you your chance. Take it like a man and make a new life for yourself." Laurence smiled, but the smile had a touch of madness and a touch of malice. He took up the notes. "Clear out and save the honor of Brother Keith. Put them back in your pocket, Keith, or I'll put them in the fire. Come, take them." And crossing to the fire, he held them to the bars. "Take them, or in they go." Keith took back the notes. "I've still got some kind of honor, Keith. If I clear out, I shall have none, not the rag of any, none left. It may be worth more to me than that. I can't tell yet. I can't tell." There was a long silence before Keith answered, "I tell you you're mistaken. No jury will convict. If they did, a judge would never hang on it. A ghoul who can rob a dead body ought to be in prison. What he did is worse than what you did, if you come to that." Laurence lifted his face. "Judge not, brother," he said. "The heart is a dark well." Keith's yellowish face grew red and swollen, as though he were mastering the tickle of a bronchial cough. "What are you going to do, then? I suppose I may ask you not to be entirely oblivious of our name, or is such a consideration unworthy of your honor?" Laurence bent his head. The gesture said more clearly than words, "Don't kick a man when he's down." "I don't know what I'm going to do." "Nothing at present." "I'm awfully sorry, Keith, awfully sorry." Keith looked at him, and, without another word, went out. To any save philosophers, reputation may be threatened almost as much by disgrace to name and family as by the disgrace of self. Keith's instinct was always to deal actively with danger. But this blow, whether it fell on him by discovery or by confession, could not be countered. As blight falls on a rose from who knows where, the scandalous murk would light on him. No repulse possible, not even a wriggling from under. Brother of a murderer hung or sent to penal servitude, his daughter niece to a murderer, his dead mother a murderer's mother. And to wait day after day, week after week, not knowing whether the blow would fall, was an extraordinarily atrocious penance, the injustice of which, to a man of rectitude, seemed daily the more monstrous. The remand had produced evidence that the murdered man had been drinking heavily on the night of his death, and further evidence of the accused professional vagabondage and destitution. It was shown, too, that for some time the archway in Glove Lane had been his favourite night haunt. He had been committed for trial in January. This time, despite misgivings, Keith had attended the police court. To his great relief, Larry was not there. But the policeman who had come up while he was looking at the archway, and given him afterwards that scare in the girl's rooms, was chief witness to the way the accused man haunted Glove Lane. Though Keith held his silk hat high, he still had the uncomfortable feeling that the man had recognized him. His conscience suffered few, if any, twinges for letting this man rest under the shadow of the murder. He genuinely believed that there was not evidence enough to convict, nor was it in him to appreciate the tortures of a vagabond shut up. The scamp deserved what he had got, for robbing a dead body, and in any case such a scarecrow was better off in prison than sleeping out under archways in December. Sentiment was foreign to Keith's character, and his justice that of those who subordinate the fates of the weak and shiftless to the needful paramountcy of the strong and well-established. His daughter came back from school for the Christmas holidays. It was hard to look up from her bright eyes and rosy cheeks and see this shadow hanging over his calm and ordered life, as in a glowing room one's eyes may catch an impending patch of darkness drawn like a spider's web across a corner of the ceiling. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve they went, by her desire, to a church in Soho, where the Christmas oratorio was being given, and coming away passed, by chance of a wrong turning, down Borrow Street. Ugh! How that startled moment when the girl had pressed herself against him in the dark, and her terror-stricken whisper, "Oh, who is it?" leaped out before him. Always that business, that ghastly business. After the trial he would have another try to get them both away, and he thrust his arm within his young daughter's, hurrying her on, out of this street where shadows filled all the winter air. But that evening, when she had gone to bed, he felt uncontrollably restless. He had not seen Larry for weeks. What was he about? What desperations were hatching in his disorderly brain? Was he very miserable? Had he perhaps sunk into a stupor of debauchery? And the old feeling of protectiveness rose up in him, a warmth born of long ago Christmas Eves, when they had stockings hung out in the night stuffed by a Santa Claus, whose hand never failed to tuck them up, whose kiss was their nightly waft into sleep. Stars were sparkling out there over the river, the sky frosty, clear and black. Bells had not begun to ring as yet. And obeying an obscure, deep impulse, Keith wrapped himself once more into his fur coat, pulled a motoring cap over his eyes, and sallied forth. In the Strand he took a cab to Fitzroy Street. There was no light in Larry's windows, and on a card he saw the words "To Let." Gone! Had he after all cleared out for good? But how, without money? And the girl? Bells were ringing now in the silent frostiness. Christmas Eve, and Keith thought, if only this wretched business were off my mind. Monstrous that one should suffer for the faults of others. He took a route which led him past Borrow Street. Solitude brooded there, and he walked resolutely down on the far side, looking hard at the girl's window. There was a light. The curtains just failed to meet, so that a thin gleam shone through. He crossed, and after glancing swiftly up and down, deliberately peered in. He only stood there perhaps 20 seconds, but visual records gleaned in a moment sometimes outlast the visions of hours and days. The electrical light was not burning, but in the center of the room the girl was kneeling in her nightgown before a little table on which were 4 lighted candles. Her arms were crossed on her breast, the candlelight shone on her fair cropped hair, on the profile of cheek and chin, on her bowed white neck. For a moment he thought her alone, then behind her saw his brother, in a sleeping suit, leaning against the wall, with arms crossed, watching. It was the expression on his face which burned the whole thing in, so that always afterwards he was able to see that little scene, such an expression as could never have been on the face of one even faintly conscious that he was watched by any living thing on earth. The whole of Larry's heart and feeling seemed to have come up out of him: yearning, mockery, love, despair. The depths of his feeling for this girl, his stress of mind, fears, hopes, the flotsam good and evil of his soul, all transfigured there, exposed and unforgettable. The candlelight shone upward onto his face, twisted by the strangest smile. His eyes, darker and more wistful than mortal eyes should be, seemed to beseech and mock the white-clad girl, who, all unconscious, knelt without movement, like a carved figure of devotion. The words seemed coming from his lips: "Pray for us! Bravo! Yes, pray for us!" And suddenly Keith saw her stretch out her arms and lift her face with a look of ecstasy, and Laurence starting forward. What had she seen beyond the candle flames? It is the unexpected which invests visions with poignancy. Nothing more strange could Keith have seen in this nest of the murky and illicit. But in sheer panic, lest he might be caught thus spying, he drew back and hurried on. So Larry was living there with her. When the moment came, he could still find him. Before going in, he stood full 5 minutes leaning on the terrace parapet before his house, gazing at the star-frosted sky, and the river cut by the trees into black pools oiled over by gleams from the embankment lamps. And deep down, behind his mere thoughts, he ached. Somehow, somewhere, ached. Beyond the cage of all that he saw and heard and thought, he had perceived something he could not reach. But the night was cold, the bell silent, for it had struck 12. Entering his house, he stole upstairs. If for Keith those 6 weeks before the Glove Lane murder trial came on were fraught with uneasiness and gloom, they were for Laurence almost the happiest since his youth. From the moment when he left his rooms and went to the girl's to live, a kind of peace and exultation took possession of him. Not by any effort of will did he throw off the nightmare hanging over him, nor was he drugged by love. He was in a sort of spiritual catalepsy. In face of fate too powerful for his will, his turmoil, anxiety, and even restlessness had ceased. His life floated in the ether of what must come will. Out of this catalepsy his spirit sometimes fell headlong into black waters. In one such whirlpool he was struggling on the night of Christmas Eve. When the girl rose from her knees, he asked her, "What did you see?" Pressing close to him, she drew him down onto the floor before the fire, and they sat, knees drawn up, hands clasped, like 2 children trying to see over the edge of the world. "It was the Virgin I saw. She stood against the wall and smiled. We shall be happy soon." "When we die, Wanda," he said suddenly, "let it be together. We shall keep each other warm out there." Huddling to him, she whispered, "Yes, oh yes. If you die, I could not go on living." It was this utter dependence on him, the feeling that he had rescued something which gave him sense of anchorage. That and his buried life in the retreat of these 2 rooms. Just for an hour in the morning, from 9 to 10, the charwoman would come, but not another soul all day. They never went out together. He would stay in bed late, while Wanda bought what they needed for the day's meals. Lying on his back, hands clasped behind his head, recalling her face, the movements of her slim, rounded, supple figure, robing itself before his gaze, feeling again the kiss she had left on his lips, the gleam of her soft eyes, so strangely dark in so fair a face. In a sort of trance, he would lie till she came back, then get up to breakfast about noon off things which she had cooked, drinking coffee. In the afternoon he would go out alone and walk for hours, anywhere, so long as it was east. To the east there was always suffering to be seen, always that which soothed him with the feeling that he and his troubles were only a tiny part of trouble. That while so many other sorrowing and shadowy creatures lived, he was not cut off. To go west was to encourage dejection. In the west all was like Keith, successful, immaculate, ordered, resolute. He would come back tired out and sit watching her cook their little dinner. The evenings were given up to love. Queer trance of an existence which both were afraid to break. No sign from her of wanting those excitements which girls who have lived her life even for a few months are supposed to need. She never asked him to take her anywhere, never in word, deed, look, seemed anything but almost rapturously content. And yet he knew, and she knew, that they were only waiting to see whether fate would turn her thumb down on them. In these days he did not drink. Out of his quarter's money, when it came in, he had paid his debts. Their expenses were very small. He never went to see Keith, never wrote to him, hardly thought of him. And from those dread apparitions, Wallen lying with the breath knocked out of him, and the little grey driven animal in the dock, he hid, as only a man can who must hide or be destroyed. But daily he bought a newspaper, and feverishly, furtively scanned its columns. Coming out of the law courts on the afternoon of January 28th, at the triumphant end of a desperately fought will case, Keith saw on a poster the words "Glove Lane Murder, Trial and Verdict." And with a rush of dismay he thought, "Good God, I never looked at the paper this morning." The elation which had filled him a second before, the absorption he had felt for 2 days now in the case so hardly won, seemed suddenly quite sickeningly trivial. What on earth had he been doing to forget that horrible business even for an instant? He stood quite still on the crowded pavement, unable, really unable, to buy a newspaper. But his face was like a piece of iron when he did step forward and hold his penny out. There it was in the stop press: "Glove Lane Murder. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. Sentence of death was passed." His first sensation was simple irritation. How had they come to commit such an imbecility? Monstrous! The evidence! Then the futility of even reading the report, of even considering how they had come to record such a verdict, struck him with savage suddenness. There it was, and nothing he could do or say would alter it. No condemnation of this idiotic verdict would help reverse it. The situation was desperate indeed. That 5 minutes' walk from the law courts to his chambers was the longest he had ever taken. Men of decided character little know beforehand what they will do in certain contingencies. For the imaginations of decided people do not endow mere contingencies with sufficient actuality. Keith had never really settled what he was going to do if this man were condemned. Often in those past weeks he had said to himself, "Of course, if they bring him in guilty, that's another thing." But now that they had, he was beset by exactly the same old arguments and feelings, the same instincts of loyalty and protection towards Laurence and himself, intensified by the fearful imminence of the danger. And yet here was this man about to be hung for a thing he had not done. Nothing could get over that. But then he was such a worthless vagabond, a ghoul who had robbed a dead body. If Larry were condemned in his stead, would there be any less miscarriage of justice? To strangle a brute who had struck you, by the accident of keeping your hands on his throat a few seconds too long, was there any more guilt in that? Was there even as much as in deliberate theft from a dead man? Reverence for order, for justice, and established fact will often march shoulder to shoulder with Jesuitry in natures to whom success is vital. In the narrow stone passage leading to his staircase, a friend had called out, "Bravo, Darrant! That was a squeak! Congratulations!" And with a bitter little smile Keith thought, "Congratulations! Aye." At the first possible moment he hurried back to the Strand, and hailing a cab, he told the man to put him down at a turning near to Borrow Street. It was the girl who opened to his knock. Startled, clasping her hands, she looked strange to Keith in her black skirt and blouse of some soft velvety stuff the color of faded roses. Her round, rather long throat was bare, and Keith noticed fretfully that she wore gold earrings. Her eyes, so pitch dark against her white face, and the short fair hair which curled onto her neck, seemed both to search and to plead. "My brother?" "He is not in, sir, yet." "Do you know where he is?" "No." "He is living with you here now?" "Yes." "Are you still as fond of him as ever, then?" With a movement as though she despaired of words, she clasped her hand over her heart, and he said, "I see." He had the same strange feeling as on his first visit to her, and when through the chink in the curtains he had watched her kneeling, of pity mingled with some faint sexual emotion. And crossing to the fire, he asked, "May I wait for him?" "Oh, please! Will you sit down?" But Keith shook his head, and with a catch in her breath she said, "You will not take him from me. I should die." He turned around on her sharply. "I don't want him taken from you. I want to help you keep him. Are you ready to go away at any time?" "Yes, oh, yes." "And he?" She answered almost in a whisper, "Yes, but there is that poor man." "That poor man is a graveyard thief, a hyena, a ghoul, not worthy of consideration." And the rasp in his own voice surprised him. "Ah," she sighed, "but I am sorry for him. Perhaps he was hungry. I have been hungry. You do things then that you would not. And perhaps he has no one to love. If you have no one to love, you can be very bad. I think of him often, in prison." Between his teeth, Keith muttered, "And Laurence?" "We do never speak of it. We are afraid." "He's not told you, then, about the trial?" Her eyes dilated. "The trial? Oh, he was strange last night. This morning, too. He got up early." Is it over?" "Yes." "What has come?" "Guilty." For a moment Keith thought she was going to faint. She had closed her eyes and swayed so that he took a step and put his hands on her arms. "Listen," he said. "Help me. Don't let Lawrence out of your sight. We must have time. I must see what they intend to do. They can't be going to hang this man. I must have time, I tell you. You must prevent his giving himself up." She stood staring at his face while he still held her arms, gripping into her soft flesh through the velvety sleeves. "Do you understand?" "Yes, but if he has already?" Keith felt the shiver which ran through her, and the thought rushed into his mind: "My God, suppose the police come around while I'm here!" If Larry had indeed gone to them, if that policeman who had seen him here the night after the murder should find him here again just after the verdict. He said almost fiercely: "Can I trust you not to let Larry out of your sight? Quick, answer!" Clasping her hands to her breast, she answered humbly: "I will try." "If he hasn't already done this, watch him like a lynx. Don't let him go out without you. I'll come tomorrow morning early. You're a Catholic, aren't you? Swear to me that you won't let him do anything till he's seen me again." She did not answer, looking past him at the door, and Keith heard a key in the latch. There was Lawrence himself, holding in his hand a great bunch of pink lilies and white narcissi. His face was pale and haggard. He said quietly: "Hello, Keith." The girl's eyes were fastened on Larry's face, and Keith, looking from one to the other, knew that he had never had more need for wariness. "Have you seen?" he said. Lawrence nodded. His expression, as a rule so telltale of his emotions, baffled Keith utterly. "Well?" "I've been expecting it. The thing can't stand, that's certain. But I must have time to look into the report. I must have time to see what I can do. Do you understand me, Larry? I must have time." He knew he was talking at random. The only thing was to get them away at once, out of reach of confession. But he dared not say so. "Promise me that you'll do nothing, that you won't go out even till I've seen you tomorrow morning." Again Lawrence nodded, and Keith looked at the girl. Would she see that he did not break that promise? Her eyes were still fixed immovably on Larry's face, and with the feeling that he could get no further, Keith turned to go. "Promise me," he said. Lawrence answered: "I promise." He was smiling. Keith could make nothing of that smile, nor of the expression in the girl's eyes, and saying, "I have your promise, I rely on it," he went. To keep from any woman who loves knowledge of her lover's mood is as hard as to keep music from moving the heart. But when that woman has lived in suffering, and for the first time knows the comfort of love, then let the lover try as he may to disguise his heart, no use. Yet by virtue of subtler abnegation she will often succeed in keeping it from him that she knows. When Keith was gone, the girl made no outcry, asked no questions, managed that Larry should not suspect her intuition. All that evening she acted as if she knew of nothing preparing within him, and through him, and within herself. His words, caresses, the very zest with which he helped her to prepare the feast, the flowers he had brought, the wine he made her drink, the avoidance of any word which could spoil their happiness, all told her he was too inexorably gay and loving. Not for her to deprive herself of these by any sign or gesture which might betray her prescience. Poor soul! She took all, and would have taken more 100-fold. She did not want to drink the wine he kept tilting into her glass, but with the acceptance learned by women who have lived her life, she did not refuse. She had never refused him anything. So much had been required of her by the detestable that anything required by a loved one was but an honor. Lawrence drank deeply, but he had never felt clearer, never seen things more clearly. The wine gave him what he wanted, an edge to these few hours of pleasure, an exaltation of energy. It dulled his sense of pity, too. It was pity he was afraid of, for himself and for this girl. To make even this tawdry room look beautiful, with firelight and candlelight, dark amber wine in the glasses, tall pink lilies spilling their saffron, exuding their hot perfume, he and even himself must look their best. And with a weight as of lead on her heart, she managed that for him, letting him strew her with flowers and crush them together with herself. Not even music was lacking to their feast. Someone was playing a pianola across the street, and the sound, very faint, came stealing when they were silent, swelling, sinking, festive, mournful, having a far-off life of its own, like the flickering fire flames before which they lay embraced, or the lilies delicate between the candles. Listening to that music, tracing with his finger the tiny veins on her breast, he lay like one recovering from a swoon. No parting, none, but sleep, as the firelight sleeps when flames die, as music sleeps on its deserted strings. And the girl watched him. It was nearly 10 when he bade her go to bed, and after she had gone obedient into the bedroom, he brought ink and paper down by the fire. The drifter, the unstable, the good-for-nothing, did not falter. He had thought, when it came to the point, he would fail himself, but a sort of rage bore him forward. If he lived on and confessed, they would shut him up, take from him the one thing he loved, cut him off from her, sand up his only well in the desert. Curse them! And he wrote by firelight, which mellowed the white sheets of paper, while against the dark curtain the girl, in her nightgown, unconscious of the cold, stood watching. Men, when they drown, remember their pasts. Like the lost poet, he had gone with the wind. Now it was for him to be true in his fashion. A man may falter for weeks and weeks, consciously, subconsciously, even in his dreams, till there comes that moment when the only thing impossible is to go on faltering. The black cap, the little driven grey man looking up at it with a sort of wonder. Faltering had ceased. He had finished now, and was but staring into the fire. No more, no more, the moon is dead, and all the people in it, the poppy maidens strew the bed, will come in half a minute. Why did doggerel start up in the mind like that? Wanda, the weed flower become so rare he would not be parted from her. The fire, the candles, and the fire, no more the flame and flicker. And by the dark curtain the girl watched. Keith went not home, but to his club, and in the room devoted to the reception of guests, empty at this hour, he sat down and read the report of the trial. The fools had made out a case that looked black enough, and for a long time, on the thick, soft carpet which let out no sound of footfall, he paced up and down, thinking. He might see the defending counsel, might surely do that as an expert who thought there had been miscarriage of justice. They must appeal. A petition, too, might be started in the last event. The thing could, must be put right yet, if only Larry and that girl did nothing. He had no appetite, but the custom of dining is too strong, and while he ate, he glanced with irritation at his fellow members. They looked so at their ease. unjust that this black cloud should hang over one blameless as any of them. Friends, connoisseurs of such things, a judge among them, came specially to his table to express their admiration of his conduct of that will case. Tonight he had real excuse for pride, but he felt none. Yet in this well-warmed, quietly glowing room, filled with decorously eating, decorously talking men, he gained insensibly some comfort. This surely was reality. That shadowy business out there, only the drear sound of a wind one must and did keep out, like the poverty and grime which had no real existence for the secure and prosperous. He drank champagne. It helped to fortify reality, to make shadows seem more shadowy. And down in the smoking room he sat before the fire, in one of those chairs which embalm after-dinner dreams. He grew sleepy there, and at 11 o'clock rose to go home. But when he had once passed down the shallow marble steps, out through the revolving door which let in no draughts, he was visited by fear, as if he had drawn it in with the breath of the January wind. Larry's face, and the girl watching it. Why had she watched like that? Larry's smile, and the flowers in his hand. Buying flowers at such a moment. The girl was his slave. Whatever he told her, she would do. But she would never be able to stop him. At this very moment he might be rushing to give himself up. His hand, thrust deep into the pocket of his fur coat, came in contact suddenly with something cold. The keys Larry had given him all that time ago. There they had lain forgotten ever since. The chance touch decided him. He turned off towards Borrow Street, walking at full speed. He could but go again and see. He would sleep better if he knew that he had left no stone unturned. At the corner of that dismal street he had to wait for solitude before he made for the house which he now loathed with a deadly loathing. He opened the outer door and shut it to behind him. He knocked, but no one came. Perhaps they had gone to bed. Again and again he knocked, then opened the door, stepped in, and closed it carefully. Candles lighted, the fire burning, cushions thrown on the floor in front of it, and strewn with flowers. The table, too, covered with flowers and with the remnants of a meal. Through the half-drawn curtain he could see that the inner room was also lighted. Had they gone out, leaving everything like this? Gone out. His heart beat. Bottles. Larry had been drinking. Had it really come? Must he go back home with this murk on him, knowing that his brother was a confessed and branded murderer? He went quickly to the half-drawn curtains and looked in. Against the wall he saw a bed, and those two in it. He recoiled in sheer amazement and relief. Asleep, with curtains undrawn, lights left on. Asleep, through all his knocking. They must both be drunk. The blood rushed up in his neck. Asleep, and rushing forward again, he called out, "Larry!" Then, with a gasp, he went towards the bed. "Larry!" No answer, no movement. Seizing his brother's shoulder, he shook it violently. It felt cold. They were lying in each other's arms, breast to breast, lips to lips, their faces white in the light shining above the dressing table. And such a shudder shook Keith that he had to grasp the brass rail above their heads. Then he bent down and, wetting his finger, placed it close to their joined lips. No two could ever swoon so utterly as that. Not even a drunken sleep could be so fast. His wet finger felt not the faintest stir of air. nor was there any movement in the pulses of their hands. No breath, no life. The eyes of the girl were closed. How strangely innocent she looked! Larry's open eyes seemed to be gazing at her shut eyes, but Keith saw that they were sightless. With a sort of sob, he drew down the lid. Then, by an impulse that he could never have explained, he laid a hand on his brother's head, and a hand on the girl's fair hair. The clothes had fallen down a little from her bare shoulder. He pulled them up, as if to keep her warm, and caught the glint of metal. A tiny gilt crucifix, no longer than a thumbnail, on a thread of steel chain, had slipped down from her breast into the hollow of the arm which lay around Larry's neck. Keith buried it beneath the clothes, and noticed an envelope pinned to the coverlet. Bending down, he read, "Please give this at once to the police. Lawrence Durant." He thrust it into his pocket. Like elastic stretched beyond its uttermost, his reason, will, faculties of calculation and resolve snapped to within him. He thought with incredible swiftness, "I must know nothing of this. I must go." And almost before he knew that he had moved, he was out again in the street. He could never have told of what he thought while he was walking home. He did not really come to himself till he was in his study. There, with trembling hand, he poured himself out whiskey and drank it off. If he had not chanced to go there, the charwoman would have found them when she came in the morning, and given that envelope to the police. He took it out. He had a right to know what was in it. He broke it open. "I, Lawrence Durant, come to die by my own hand, declare that this is a solemn and true confession. I committed what is known as the Glove Lane murder on the night of November the 27th last, in the following way," and on, to the last words. "We didn't want to die, but we could not bear separation, and I couldn't face letting an innocent man be hung for me. I do not see any other way. I beg that there may be no post mortem on our bodies. The stuff we have taken is some of that which will be found on the dressing table. Please bury us together. Lawrence Durant, January the 28th, about 10:00 p.m." Full 5 minutes Keith stood with those sheets of paper in his hand. While the clock ticked, the wind moaned a little in the trees outside. The flames licked the logs with the quiet click and ruffle of their intense, far away life down there on the hearth. Then he roused himself and sat down to read the whole again. There it was, just as Larry had told it to him, nothing left out, very clear, even to the addresses of people who could identify the girl as having once been Wallen's wife or mistress. It would convince. Oh yes, it would convince. The sheets dropped from his hand. Very slowly he was grasping the appalling fact that on the floor beside his chair lay the life or death of yet another man. That by taking this confession he had taken it into his own hands, the fate of the vagabond lying under sentence of death. That he could not give him back his life without incurring the smirch of this disgrace, without even endangering himself. If he let this confession reach the authorities, he could never escape the gravest suspicion that he had known of the whole affair during these 2 months. He would have to attend the inquest, be recognized by that policeman as having come to the archway to see where the body had lain, as having visited the girl the very evening after the murder. Who would believe in the mere coincidence of such visits on the part of the murderer's brother? But apart from that suspicion, the fearful scandal which so sensational an affair must make would mar his career, his life, his young daughter's life. Larry's suicide with this girl would make sensation enough as it was, but nothing to that other. Such a death had its romance, involved him in no way save as a mourner, could perhaps even be hushed up. The other, nothing could hush that up, nothing prevent its ringing to the housetops. He got up from his chair, and for many minutes roamed the room, unable to get his mind to bear on the issue. Images kept starting up before him. The face of the man who handed him wig and gown each morning, puffy and curious, with a leer on it he had never noticed before. His young daughter's lifted eyebrows, mouth drooping, eyes troubled. The tiny gilt crucifix glinting in the hollow of the dead girl's arm, the sightless look in Larry's unclosed eyes, even his own thumb and finger pulling the lids down. And then he saw a street and endless people passing, turning to stare at him. And stopping in his tramp, he said aloud, "Let them go to hell. 7 days' wonder." Was he not trustee to that confession? Trustee! After all, he had done nothing to be ashamed of, even if he had kept knowledge dark. A brother! Who could blame him? And he picked up those sheets of paper. But, like a great murky hand, the scandal spread itself about him. Its coarse, malignant voice seemed shouting, "Paper, paper, Glove Lane murder, suicide and confession of brother of well-known Casey, well-known Casey's brother, murder and suicide, paper." Was he to let loose that flood of foulness? Was he, who had done nothing, to smirch his own little daughter's life, to smirch his dead brother, their dead mother, himself, his own valuable, important future? And all for a sewer rat. Let him hang, let the fellow hang if he must. And that was not certain. Appeal, petition, he might, he should be saved. To have got thus far and then, by his own action, topple himself down. With a sudden darting movement, he thrust the confession in among the burning coals, and a smile licked at the folds in his dark face, like those flames licking the sheets of paper, till they writhed and blackened. With the toe of his boot he dispersed their scorched and crumbling wafer. Stamp them in, stamp in that man's life. Burnt. No more doubts, no more of this gnawing fear. Burnt. A man, an innocent sewer rat. Recoiling from the fire, he grasped his forehead. It was burning hot, and seemed to be going round. Well, it was done. Only fools without will or purpose regretted. And suddenly he laughed. So Larry had died for nothing. He had no will, no purpose, and was dead. He and that girl might now have been living, loving each other in the warm night, away at the other end of the world, instead of lying dead in the cold night here. Fools and weaklings regretted, suffered from conscience and remorse. A man trod firmly, held to his purpose, no matter what. He went to the window and drew back the curtain. What was that? A gibbet in the air? A body hanging? Ah, only the trees, the dark trees, the winter skeleton trees. Recoiling, he returned to his armchair and sat down before the fire. It had been shining like that, the lamp turned low, his chair drawn up, when Larry came in that afternoon 2 months ago. Bah! He had never come at all. It was a nightmare. He had been asleep. How his head burned! And leaping up, he looked at the calendar on his bureau. January the 28th. No dream. His face hardened and darkened. On! Not like Larry. On! End of tale number 1. Recording by David Wales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.